Arms Animal Sanctuary. Thank you so much for joining us on our final evening of celebration of 5 years of spreading ahimsa, nonviolence to all beings through compassion, supported by our 4 pillars of connection, education, inspiration, and action. We are so grateful for each and every one of our outstanding speakers. Each has made a beautiful difference in making the world a better and a more compassionate place to live. I am truly honored to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, First Gentleman Marlon Reese. Marlon is a freelance writer and an animal welfare advocate. After graduating from the University of Colorado at Boulder, Marlon served on the board of directors of Out Boulder and worked with the Community Foundation, Boulder County, to advocate for equal opportunities for all families. His writing has been featured in the Washington Post, Political, USA Today, 5280, and the Denver Post. As First Gentleman of Colorado, Marlon looks forward to advancing animal welfare, public health, and equality for all. Marlon has a message that will make you think and it will touch your heart. And I hope it will move you to act and helping us create a more compassionate world. We need your help. All life on earth truly depends on us making more compassionate choices. We cannot do this work without you. Please go to lovinarms.org and donate whatever dollar amount you can. Everything you donate until the end of September will be matched by a generous donor. We will create a more compassionate world for all. Together, a world where we will spread ahimsa, nonviolence to all beings. Welcome, Marlon, our newest board member, and thank you so much for presenting with us this evening.
Good evening, friends. It's wonderful to see so many familiar and friendly faces. For those watching who I've not yet had the pleasure of meeting in person, my name is Marlon Reese. I'm the First Gentleman of Colorado. More importantly, I'm an animal lover, a person who respects, admires, and learns from animals, someone who looks to the natural world for the wisdom of how to lead a good life. I'd like to express my profound gratitude to Luvin Arms Animal Sanctuary for the gift of closing out what has been a truly unforgettable week of hearing from extraordinary people speaking from their hearts about the intrinsic value of all life on earth. On this closing night of the virtual 5th Gala, I think it is appropriate that we take a few steps back to admire the beauty and intricacy of the big picture. What is life beyond survival? All of us are motivated by the drive for self-preservation, but to what end? Certainly, we don't spend our days and nights making it through simply to reach a chronological number. Life means more to us than simply getting old. We don't press on through hardships just for the sake of pressing on. At its best, life is shared. When awareness dawns on us that we are part of something greater than ourselves, that is when we feel most alive. In many ways, the only way we can recognize meaning in ourselves is through discovery of what we mean to others. How many of you are familiar with the Neoplatonic concept of Anima Mundi? In medieval Latin, this phrase translates to the world soul. It is the concept that intrinsic connection exists between all living things on the planet. In the same way that we conceive of a soul giving life and individuality to our limbs, each of us contributes a part to the greater consciousness of the planet. This notion of a world connected, often in unseen ways, is a lens through which we can understand how one human in China exploiting one bat sparked the deadliest pandemic to affect the globe in 100 years. It's also a way to contextualize our place in nature in a way that allows us to see that even a single plant or animal displaced from its native ecosystem, is enough to change the identity of that ecosystem. If we accept Anima Mundi as the principle, then One Health, as it is known, is the principle in practice. Many of you are no doubt familiar with the tenets of the One Health model, which at its core is a blueprint for policymaking that recognizes the interconnection between people, animals, plants, and their shared environment. One Health is a model rooted in the medical and social sciences. It is supported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as a way to achieve health on a system-wide scale. Most importantly, it posits that human health does not exist in isolation. Rather, it scales up or down in tandem with non-human and environmental health. It makes sense, doesn't it? Regardless of how we as a species perceive our place in the universe, that perception does not free us from the ties that bind all life on Earth. Clean air to breathe, fresh water to drink, steady ground on which to stand. These are not the particular needs of humans, they are the shared values of all life. But what else do we share? A desire not to suffer. And beyond that, though we might not articulate this particular thought for ourselves, we hope that by not suffering, we will be free to notice the world around us, to use our senses, to enjoy the experience of being alive. We want days without obligations. We want free time that is truly free and unstructured. We want the chance simply to exist. The love of my life, as some of you may know, is my Cairn Terrier, Gia. And I can tell you that the very best days I've lived have been plentiful with moments sitting beside her in the shade of a tree, listening to the sounds of a stream, watching the sunlight make patterns through the treetops, gazing at cottonwood as it drifted down, hearing birdsong. Animals live in the purest sense of the word because they don't cross their wires between thought and action. Whereas Gia wakes up each morning to a new day of new sensory experiences, I wake up too often to the leftovers of what I put on yesterday's back burner, metaphorically speaking. In the richness of their sensory experience, animals see the world with perfect clarity, unmuddled by the expectations and disappointments that we as humans so often project. What they think and feel are pure reflections because, unlike us, they're not concerned that the world is moral, amoral, immoral. There's a reason I want to focus on the clarity with which animals see. There's an important lesson that I believe once upon a time people knew, but we've long since forgotten. We are obsessed with hierarchies, with labeling and ranking all that surrounds us. Some of us try and succeed in learning what truly matters, and that's what we have, life itself. But most of us spend our time dwelling on what we lack, what we do to make up those deficits, or why we still feel a sense of emptiness even when we have material wealth, all of the things that are supposedly supposed to make us happy. What's missing? That's a question I suspect all of us have asked ourselves. This leads me to an important point. Many of us want animals to gain status in the eyes of the law. Not nature's law, but our law. And I feel qualified to speak on this topic from my perspective because I spend most of every day around politicians and policymakers trying to make the world a better place by writing better laws. So we want animals to have the dignity of a life free of suffering, and we want them to have respect to live as nature dictates. But there's an important question. Do we think that the best life to lead is a human life? When we talk about dignity and respect, are we actually referring to the dignity of being treated like a human being and not like the proverbial animal? We frequently hear as an insult, "I'm being treated like an animal," or "you're treating that person like an animal," as if this was an insult. When we talk about respect, do we mean the kind of respect that people want to be judged by our character? These measures we fight for in our laws and ultimately on the battleground of our collective conscience are very much human interpretations of dignity and respect. The dignity we want for animals is humane treatment, and that's an important word, humane. Spelled, of course, Human, and then there's that E at the end. But it's based on the premise of humanity. The respect that we want for them is respect based on the idea of opportunity, how to get ahead. But when you think about it, do we really know what animals want? Do we know what they think or what they don't think? Is the so-called success that we aspire to as people the same success that other species want or need? Perhaps you feel differently, but for my own part, I feel neither comfortable nor qualified to rule on what animals do and do not want. I certainly don't know what animals think, and no matter how much we try, we can't ever truly know what the world looks like through the eyes of another. What is the natural thing to do, I ask you, when one doesn't know something? It's to be careful, to tread lighter, to take care because one worries about saying or doing the wrong thing and paying the consequences. That's what one does if what is unknown concerns another human being. Yet somehow, in the case of non-human animals, what we don't know translates into a lack of care and concern, the very opposite of what we feel towards each other as humans. Instead, we use what we don't know to justify unspeakable acts of violence and disregard for the basic fact of existence and for the existence to be a value in and of itself. We cite an animal's voicelessness as the reason that we must speak up on their behalf. But animals aren't voiceless. They simply speak a language different than the one we speak. If a stranger greets us in another language, do we automatically assume a lack of intelligence? No, of course not. We accept that diversity is not only acceptable, but desirable. The question I put to you is, diversity, is it as a concept not wrapped up in the greater idea of biodiversity? But in animals, we equate foreign language with an incapacity for thought and an insensitivity for feeling. The sounds we hear from animals are not the words we recognize. An experience, as we know, that does not express itself somehow equates meaninglessness. We are all familiar with the expression silence equals death from the early days of the AIDS pandemic. For non-human animals, that expression rings truer than ever. Many believe that if you cannot justify your existence intelligibly, then you don't deserve to exist. Or you, at the very least, you don't deserve to exist in a way that elevates. Joy and sorrow, pain and pleasure are validated less by their existence and more by our ability to describe them. Our interior lives, the very mystery of consciousness, is made real by our ability to tell it in the form of a story. And animals, by all outward appearances, for many of us, do not tell us stories. Their lives consist of two moments, the moment they're born and the moment they die. Beyond the base physicality of those two moments, there is, of course, more. But many of us are not prepared to contemplate such questions because doing so forces us to ask ourselves if our actions against them are right or wrong. Our ability to deny animals dignity and respect, not human dignity and respect, but dignity and respect as individuals within an overarching biodiversity, hinges on their silence. So even though we as advocates for animals traffic in phrases like be a voice for the voiceless, I think it is vitally important that we recognize that animals do have a voice. And our mission is, in fact, the humility to admit that human voices are not the only voices that matter. To my way of thinking, diversity is an acknowledgement and a celebration of individuality. Each of us comes into the world ready to do our part. And as we travel the arc of life, our experiences and the way we are shaped by them contribute to our distinctness. Why then is biodiversity not celebrated and mourned when it is lost in the same way that diversity is? All creatures, great and small, have stories, jobs they do in service to a greater whole, to a world consciousness, and experiences that accord them individuality. If what we want for animals is for them to be treated fairly, we must start with this simple premise. They are not voiceless. They do have stories. And neither of those facts should be challenged simply because we as people speak a different language. The topic of this talk is how we can create systemic change that benefits non-human animals, all animals. And I believe that we need to start with a basic understanding that when we don't know something, we take greater care. Our policies should not be driven by fear of what we don't know for certain, but respect for what is mysterious and what is possible. Much as we gaze at the stars and marvel at the universe beyond our physical reach, we need people to believe that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And we must stop thinking of dignity and respect in strictly human terms. This kind of change is more abstract, certainly, than rewriting our laws. Instead, it requires humility in the face of questions to which we do not have definitive answers. If we can maintain faith in things we cannot prove, and I believe that we can, then certainly we can bring ourselves to have faith in the idea that non-human animals live lives much richer than the beginning and the end points. There are stories there, and we need to listen. Setting aside the grander concept of Anima Mundi and its concretization in the One Health model, let's consider clear and present ways in which our fate as humans is inextricably intertwined with the fate of non-humans and the health of our planet on a global scale. As the world plods through the travails of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're reminded that too often we don't care about something until it poses a personal risk to our safety and the safety of our loved ones. So let's make this as relevant to people as we possibly can. Many of us remember COVID-19's precursor, SARS, which is believed to have started in a horseshoe bat before jumping to civets and finally to people in wet markets in China. Then came MERS, another coronavirus that likely started in bats before jumping to dromedary camels and then on to humans. The World Health Organization currently advises people should avoid contact with camels, drinking raw camel milk or camel urine, or eating meat that has not been properly cooked. Ebola traces back to our handling and consumption of bushmeat, and in particular, ape meat, the meat of our nearest evolutionary cousins. What we know of COVID-19 tells us that it likely originated in bats as a passive asymptomatic virus. But the oft unacknowledged truth of clearing rainforests to create grazing pasture for livestock is that in so doing, we put ourselves in proximity to pathogens that humans were never meant to encounter. We exacerbate this exposure when pseudoscience suggests that wildlife possesses medicinal properties that, when consumed, can treat or even cure common ailments. As if our own manufactured encounters with these animals weren't enough, we dig ourselves deeper when we remove species from their native habitats and cram them together in settings like the wet market in Wuhan, where COVID-19 is suspected of starting. This isn't a case of one of these things doesn't belong. You look at the number of species, the diversity, the biodiversity of species that are held in these markets, and quite literally nothing belongs. It's all artificial. The link between our manipulation and, really more accurately, our abuse of the natural world and the rise of zoonotic diseases is incontrovertible. What are some other examples of diseases that we have had a hand in creating by the constancy of our trespasses in the natural world and the artificial settings in which we force together species that were never meant to meet? HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, likely started in apes. Tuberculosis and measles started in goats and sheep. Smallpox in camels, leprosy in water buffalo, whooping cough in pigs, typhoid fever in chickens, and the common cold in cows and horses. We have rabies, Lyme disease, avian flu, swine flu, seasonal flu. The list goes on. But our mishandling of animals and environments, vectors as they're scientifically termed, extends far beyond our interaction with wildlife. Did you know that in America, currently, we inoculate livestock in overcrowded factory farms with fully 80% of the antibiotics that we annually use in the United States? The reason this is done is simple but terribly misguided. When you force too many animals to live shoulder to shoulder in filthy living conditions, disease is inevitable. Though we know that these settings have and will continue to be the stepping stone that takes disease from their first iterations to the more virulent forms known as superbugs, we just can't seem to learn our lesson. In 2016, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention identified the first US case of a multi-drug resistant bacterium that originated in pigs raised for food. This bacterium demonstrated resistance to an antibiotic called colistin, a so-called antibiotic of last resort. As a result, we as people are now facing the prospect of a post-antibiotic world in which doctors will have nothing to offer critically ill patients but supportive care and hope against hope, that our natural immune response will prevail. Yet we know for the 190,000 plus Americans who've perished of COVID-19, natural immune response hasn't been enough to save their lives. Perhaps more terrifying still, this disease that we created, that we paved the way to, appears to kill patients by overstimulating immune response. So however you want to slice it, we're falling on our own swords. Yes, our fates, those of humans and non-humans, are one and the same. Recently, I've been working with some truly wonderful people who are trying to stop the senseless killing of prairie dogs in Boulder and Canada geese in Denver. When we write off entire species as expendable and we kill without knowing, we invite a callousness into our hearts that robs us of the ability to walk through the world with gratitude for the beauty of nature. We stop seeing life as a gift, perceiving it instead as a burden. This perceived burden of lives that, by simply existing in places and ways that nature designed, remind us of the artifice with which people have designed life with the wrong goals in mind. Not to live in the moment, but to cast our gaze forward into an unknown future. Not to be content with what we have, but to constantly quest for more. I want to conclude by focusing on what we all can do to create systemic change for all animals. All animals, not just the ones who live with us, or the ones we see on television, those on our dinner plates, or in captivity with nothing more than placards that list where they originate, what they eat, how strong or fast they are. When I say all animals, I mean it in the sense that we are all connected and we are all interdependent. The lives we see and the ones we don't, each one is important. Each one has a story. Each one fulfills a purpose. Getting to that place requires that we acknowledge a system of valuation not based on what we as people have deemed important, but on what nature has so clearly defined as important, simply because it exists. It's here in the world. That is the value. Our values tend to become our laws long before they are ever signed into law by elected officials. If we can't bring ourselves to believe that something is right, it is unlikely we will ever bother ourselves enough to enshrine it in law. In many ways, this makes creating systemic change easier to achieve because it depends less on changing one another's minds, which so often seems to rub people the wrong way, and more on asking people to admit that they care. Do you care? I care. And the very best way I know to accomplish encouraging caring in others is to share stories. Storytelling is what ignites the imagination. Knowing is what leads to caring. And by that same token, not knowing is what allows us to commit acts of violence. Doing harm is bearable when we don't have to see the pained expressions of the victims of our cruelty. One of the things I love best about Loving Arms is that we learn the stories of each and every animal who has been saved. We learn their histories, and then we are invited to become a part of those stories. We get that chance to sit side by side with the animals and take in the world together. There's a quote I love by the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer William Saroyan. I'd like to share it with you tonight. In the time of your life, live, so that in that good time there shall be no ugliness or death for yourself or for any life your life touches. Seek goodness everywhere, and when it is found, bring it out of its hiding place and let it be free and unashamed. Discover in all things that which shines and is beyond corruption. Encourage virtue in whatever heart it may have been driven into secrecy and sorrow by the shame and terror of the world. Be the inferior of no man, nor of any man be the superior. Remember that every man is a variation of yourself. In the time of your life, live, so that in that wondrous time you shall not add to the misery and sorrow of the world, but shall smile to the infinite delight and mystery of it. Friends, it is a delight to be with you tonight, to have the privilege of sharing my thoughts with you on this final night of the Loving Arms Virtual 5th Gala. So many of us have already glimpsed the world as we wish it to be, but few of us have considered that such a world already exists. If we can find it within ourselves, not to try and control, but to live with it, to live within it. I believe that that is the world that is here. I believe it is a world that we can embrace. And I believe that there is wisdom in simplicity, and that our lives are not a march from one extreme to another, but a stream of consciousness in a world made rich by color and sound, scent, taste, and touch. All life exists with the capacity to sense in a world that is vivid. Thank you so much.